So post-Hurricane Katrina, the federal government recognized that there was a colossal inadequacy in the response to that large disaster. And that inadequacy occurred at every level of government, whether it was the federal government, the state government, or at the local level. And we just were not prepared to respond or to care for animals in a large-scale incident. So there was the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. It was a piece of federal legislation. And the purpose of that was to strengthen FEMA's preparedness and response capabilities on all levels, not just for animals, but for all levels of response. And for the first time ever, it modified federal law to account for the needs of companion animals in disaster legislation. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So it also gave new responsibility to FEMA for companion animal issues, which they then delegated to the USDA. So the legislation that was enacted in 2006 at the federal level is called the PETS Act, or the Pet Evacuation Transportation Standards Act. And it amended the Stafford Act, which is the law that gives FEMA the power to reimburse the states during emergencies. And one of the requirements of that was that state and local emergency plans now had to account for the needs of companion and service animals in their plans regarding how they would be evacuated, how they would be transported, and how they would be sheltered during a disaster. And about a week after the federal act was passed, New York State passed its own version in state government. It amended Article 2B of our executive law. That is the law in our state that governs emergency response. And again, at the state level, it requires the counties and the localities to address the needs of animals regarding shelter, evacuation, and transportation. However, with many of these pieces of legislation, it doesn't tell you how to do it, and it doesn't provide any funding for doing it. So it also doesn't provide any penalty if you don't do it. So you can see why we sometimes have difficulty getting compliance with it. So one of the ways that counties can meet that requirement to provide for the needs of animals is to develop what's called a county animal response team, or a CART. ESART is really just, it's like emergency management. It's how the program is coordinated across the state at the state level. ESART does not have any resources that can be deployed. It doesn't have personnel. It's just really a steering committee of people that help the counties to develop their own plans. So the mission is to provide prevention, response, and recovery for animal emergencies. And really what we're looking to do is to develop a cadre of pre-trained individuals, people that know how to respond to animal emergencies. So if Art or his predecessor has an issue and they need response from an animal perspective, there are people that already understand emergency management and understand the needs of animals during disaster, and he has a group of people that he can call on to help him. And we'll talk at the end about a few situations that have occurred in the country in the past couple of years where there were not people to help in those situations. So Art briefly mentioned the training. Unfortunately, there is a bit of training that's required. As Art mentioned, all of this training is available online. There's no charge for it. I'm not going to lie, every one of those classes is boring, but you still have to do it. So, ICS is Incident Command System, and you need to have a familiarity with it because it's how all emergency response is structured, whether it's at the local level or the state level or the federal level. And you need to know if someone says what's an incident commander or what's logistics or what's planning, you just need to have some familiarity with what people are saying so that we're all speaking the same language and we can respond more efficiently. We also require you to take what's called the National Incident Management System. It's the national framework for responding to emergencies. And then a hazmat awareness. And we ask all people that participate on a CART to sign a code of conduct. And that basically says you're there to do what the emergency manager has asked you to do. If you're affiliated with some other rescue organization, etc., you're not there to promote that you're there to just serve the emergency manager. So the requirements of an animal response team, by statute, by law, they can only deploy at the request of the emergency manager. So it's his designee that says he needs to activate his team, and then they can go about and do whatever he's asked. It could be a weather disaster, it could be a large-scale cruelty case or hoarding case. It could be anything that or the emergency manager decides he needs the help of trained animal responders to assist him with. So when people have completed their training, those 4 things that we mentioned on the other page, the volunteers would get entered into a database. It's called the Serve New York database, which is the Department of Health's database it's how all volunteers in state programs are listed. And eventually, the emergency manager will be able to go into that database and see who's listed within his county and can be called on to be a volunteer. And we keep talking about the training because in our state, we were very lucky to get a piece of legislation passed, and that legislation covers animal response team volunteers as temporary unpaid state employees, which means that if you're activated by part, you're covered for liability and workers' comp during that period of activation. So traditionally, since the inception of this program, not being able to provide coverage for volunteers has been a stumbling block for counties to do that. So that's why you have to take the training. The statute that goes with that law says you have to complete these steps, then you're qualified and eligible for insurance. And then I put up a few websites. The ESART website has the application for the program. It also has some other information. It needs to be updated. Hopefully we'll get that done. The code of conduct, links to the training classes are there, as well as the application. And then for those who are diving into this a little bit deeper, NASEP, or the National Alliance of State Animal and Agricultural Emergency Programs, they have several best practice groups that have developed planning guides and templates that can be used to think about how are you going to set up a shelter in your community, how would you do transportation, how would you do evacuation. So there are several subject areas, and all of that is free of charge to be used for counties in planning. And then the NARS is the National Animal Rescue Sheltering Coalition. That is a coalition of all the national non-governmental groups that respond to animal disasters like ASPCA, International Fund for Animal Welfare, etc. One of the important things that's happened from the non-governmental perspective since Katrina is that I mentioned it was a very turf-oriented response. Now all of the national players work together, and it's a very seamless type of work. So one group will come in for 2 weeks, then they'll be relieved by another national group that comes in. And so there's no more of that, I'm here to do it all and get all the glory. They very much work together, cooperate, and everybody has a standard operating procedure, which has been hugely beneficial. I mentioned I was going to bring up some instances when people aren't trained and don't know what they're doing and try to help out with animals. Just this spring, outside of Albany, we had a truck rollover that was transporting cattle. And there were 18 cows that were dead or injured, and there was nobody available for hours that could come out and immediately assist and euthanize those animals that were injured. And so the purpose of having a cart would be hopefully that people on that would have the resources to at least assist the veterinarian or would know the veterinarian to be able to get them out there to assist and get those animals out of their misery. Another instance, last year when the tornadoes were happening in Oklahoma, they had a large congregate human shelter, and someone arrived with their dog and they were turned away at the door and said that they had a no pet policy. And they said you can go put your dog in the car and you can come and stay at the shelter. And the guy could not stand the thought of being separated from his animal and leaving that outside to be in harm's way, so he went out and stayed in the car with his dog, which completely defeats the purpose of setting up a shelter. You might as well have stayed home. So again, it underscores the importance of why we need to provide sheltering and other resources for animals. And then last year in Colorado, when they had floods, people had to be evacuated by helicopter, and there were several families that were stranded. They did get to evacuate with their animals. The first responders were not familiar with how to transport animals, especially during a disaster. and they transported a cat in a cardboard box that was duct taped by helicopter. They put it on the helicopter with the family. The doors on the helicopter were left open, and after the helicopter was airborne, the cat escaped from the box and ran out the open doors and died. And it happened twice, so it wasn't a one-time incident. It happened twice during that disaster. So again, by having people that understand you can't put a cat in a cardboard box and transport it on a helicopter during a disaster, it helps to minimize much of the increased emotional trauma that occurs during a disaster. It helps people to get out, to be cared for in a timely and efficient way. That's my last. So that's that was my best one. Any questions? Do you want to bring at the end?